She dismissed him in front of 11 board members, 2 city councilors, and a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Ottawa River. Diane Calloway had her head of security escort a man out of her boardroom like he was a delivery driver who'd wandered in through the wrong door. She didn't ask his name. He was wearing a flannel shirt and carrying a Tim Hortons cup, and when the security guard touched his arm, he smiled, which should have been the first sign. It wasn't. 47 minutes later, her phone rang. $80 million, gone. And the man they'd walked out, he was the one who had it. If you're watching this from somewhere in Canada, drop your city in the comments. This one travels. The morning had started the way the worst ones always do, quietly, dressed up to look routine. Diane Calloway woke at 5:50 to a single alarm she didn't need because she hadn't really slept. She lay in the dark of her condo on the 16th floor in Centretown, listening to the Rideau Canal outside doing nothing, just existing, the way water did when it had no opinion about your problems. She'd been running Calloway Infrastructure Partners for 6 years. She'd taken the CEO chair at 31. The year her mother's MS had progressed enough that someone needed to make the hard decisions about the company her parents had spent 22 years building out of a small civil engineering firm in Sudbury. The board at the time had been skeptical. One of them, a man named Gerald, who wore the same blue tie to every meeting, had said in a voice that was careful not to be condescending and failed completely, "It's a significant responsibility for someone at your stage." She'd smiled at him across the table and thought, watch. She'd watched Gerald leave the board 2 years later. She'd stayed. But staying wasn't the same as winning, not permanently. It was more like holding a position in a long negotiation that never technically ended. Today was supposed to be different. The Hartwell Group deal was supposed to be the thing that changed the shape of everything. She made coffee, the old way, a mocha pot her father had sent from Sudbury when she'd moved to Ottawa, the one that made the apartment smell like Sunday mornings at home, and stood at the window while it brewed. 80 million. She'd said the number so many times over the past month that it had started to feel abstract, like a word you repeat until it stops meaning anything. Her VP of Finance, a precise and careful man named Stewart, had laid it out plainly in February. Without a significant capital injection before the end of Q2, Calloway Infrastructure was going to spend the next 2 years in a slow, grinding contraction. They could survive. Probably. But probably in that context felt like standing on ice near a drainage grate in April, listening to the sound change under your feet. Hartwell Capital was supposed to end, probably. The man behind Hartwell Capital wasn't someone who appeared in Financial Post profiles or spoke at C-suite conferences. His name was Evan Hartwell. He was 34. He'd built the firm from a regional seed fund started in his late 20s into one of the most consistent performing private capital groups in the country. Not the flashiest, not the biggest, but in terms of actual decisions, actual track record, exceptional, the kind of exceptional that other investors referenced in low voices at dinners where everyone pretended they weren't networking. He didn't have a publicist. His LinkedIn hadn't been updated in 3 years. When a regional magazine had profiled him 18 months ago, he'd agreed to the interview only because the proceeds funded a youth apprenticeship program in Northern Ontario. The writer had noted that he'd declined to be photographed for 6 weeks before finally agreeing, and that when the photo was taken, he'd shown up in work clothes because, he said, he hadn't thought to bring anything else. Diane had spent 4 weeks preparing for this meeting. Late nights with her team, 2 full restructures of the pitch deck, a complete rebuild of the 5-year financial projections. Her chair, a man named Franklin Reese, who had the manner of someone who had been important for long enough that he'd stopped performing it, had been enthusiastic over dinner 3 weeks ago. Hartwell, money doesn't just fund you, he'd said. It signals something. It tells the market you're serious. She'd believed him. She'd believed all of it. The coffee was ready. She poured it into a mug that said barely functioning across the front, a gift from her assistant Priya, who had terrible taste in mugs and extraordinary taste in everything else. Diane wrapped both hands around it and thought about the day. By the time she was in the car, she'd checked her email 3 times and answered 1 call from Stewart confirming the AV setup, and 1 from building security about parking validation for guests. "I'll make sure everything's ready," she told them. "This matters." "Of course," the desk attendant said, in the tone of someone who'd been told things mattered many, many times before. The offices of Calloway Infrastructure Partners occupied the top 3 floors of a glass building near the Byward Market. Professional enough to signal stability, not so ostentatious as to worry a client paying public sector rates. The lobby had a wall of framed project photos, bridges, transit corridors, water treatment systems, the unglamorous infrastructure that held cities together. Diane had approved the display herself. Her father had always said that you should be proud of what you actually built, not what you said you were going to build. She arrived at 7:20 and went straight to her office. Priya was already there, iPad in hand, expression of someone who had a list. Projectors sorted. Franklin's running 12 minutes late. Catering confirmed, but they sent the wrong roast. We ordered medium, they sent dark. Diane set down her bag. Does it matter? Priya looked at her over the iPad. It matters to the kind of people who notice. Diane almost smiled. Fix it. She spent the next 25 minutes at her desk going through the pitch one final time. Not because she needed to, she could recite it backwards, but because doing something felt better than sitting with whatever was humming inside her chest. Her mother had always said that nerves were just care that hadn't found a direction yet. Diane wasn't sure she agreed, but she kept the saying around the way you kept things from people you loved, even when you'd complicated your feelings about them. At 7:50, she walked into the prep meeting on the floor below. Stewart at the head of the table, 2 analysts with laptops, her communications director, 2 members of the legal team. They ran the pitch in 35 minutes. Clean, tight, the numbers held. You're ready, Stewart said when they were done. She nodded. She didn't say what she was actually thinking, which was, I've been ready for 6 weeks. I need this to be over. The boardroom on the top floor was the best room in the building. Windows on 2 sides, a table that seated 18, and on a clear day, and it was clear today, that particular March clarity that came after a week of gray. You could see all the way to Gatineau on the Quebec side. The kind of room that made you feel, briefly, like the world was organized. Diane arrived at 9:40. She adjusted the seating cards, checked the presentation on the main screen, drank half a glass of water. The room filled with her team, people she'd worked alongside for years. Franklin arrived at 9:52, looking relaxed in the particular way of men who'd learned to perform ease as a power move. He made a joke about the Queensway traffic. He took his seat at the far end of the table from Diane, a position she had always thought was slightly telling. Hartwell Capital's team was expected at 10 sharp. At 9:57, the boardroom door opened. Diane was in conversation with Stewart when she heard the shift in the room. Not a sound exactly, a change in the quality of the air, the way a space recalibrates when something unexpected has entered. She turned. A man was standing near the doorway. He was maybe 34, 35. Average height, unhurried posture. He was wearing dark trousers and a flannel shirt and a blue-gray plaid that looked like something you'd buy at a Canadian Tire adjacent to work gloves. No tie, no visible ID lanyard. He was holding a Tim Hortons cup, the medium size, the one that cost $2.19, and looking at the Ottawa River through the windows with what appeared to be mild, genuine interest. One of her junior coordinators, a 23-year-old named Devin, who had been assigned to executive reception that week and was taking it seriously, appeared at the man's elbow. Can I help you? The man turned. He had a calm face, not blank, just unhurried. The face of someone who had heard this question before and had no particular feelings about hearing it again. I'm good, thanks, he said. His voice was even, unremarkable. This is a restricted access floor, Devin said with the confidence of someone who had been told to protect a room and intended to do so. Do you have a badge? A confirmation email? Something moved in the man's expression. A private notation being made. I don't have a badge, he said. Devin straightened. Then I'm going to need to ask you to wait in reception while Devin. Diane had crossed the room, moving to intercept, mostly because the meeting was starting in 3 minutes, and she needed this resolved. She looked at the man. There was something she couldn't place, a quality of stillness that registered without announcing itself. I'm sorry. Who are you here with? The man looked at her. His expression didn't change. I'm here for the 10 o'clock, he said. Diane glanced toward the door. Hartwell Capital had confirmed 2 attendees, a senior analyst named Patricia Lau and the principal himself. She looked back at the man in the flannel shirt with the Tim Hortons cup. She should have asked his name. She would tell herself this later, at 2 a.m. 3 days from now, that the information had been right there. That one question would have changed everything. She didn't ask. I'm sorry, she said, and she heard herself using the particular voice she'd developed for boardroom efficiency, the one that kept things moving. This meeting is for confirmed guests. If you're with the Hartwell team, we'd need verification. If you can reach someone to call up. He's been cleared, said a voice from the doorway. Patricia Lau had appeared. Late 30s, sharp blazer, leather folio, wearing the expression of someone watching something go sideways in slow motion and deciding in real time whether to intervene. She was looking at the man in the flannel shirt with an expression Diane couldn't entirely read. He's cleared, Patricia said again, voice controlled but tight. Then he's welcome to. Devin started. Devin. Franklin's voice from the far end of the table, not looking up from his phone, handle it. And Devin handled it, the 23-year-old who has been told to handle something handles it, with complete commitment to the instruction and zero curiosity about whether the instruction was right. He touched the man's elbow. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out. You can wait downstairs." The man looked at Devin's hand on his arm. Then he looked at Diane. She was already looking at Stuart, who was trying to catch her eye about something. The clock said 9:59. She turned away. She heard Devin speaking quietly, heard the slight shuffle of movement, heard the door open and close. She looked at Patricia Lau, who was standing very still near the entrance, and said, "Mrs. Lau, welcome. We're ready to begin." Patricia looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to say what they were actually thinking. Then she sat down, placed her folio on the table, and looked at the presentation screen. "Mr. Hartwell isn't with me," she said, almost as an aside. "He comes separately." Diane looked at the door. Something cold moved through her from the inside. The meeting started on time. Diane presented. She was good at this. She'd been doing it long enough to run on professional autopilot while part of her brain was somewhere else entirely, assembling pieces it didn't want to assemble. She walked through the projections. She answered Patricia's questions with precision. Evan Hartwell's empty chair sat at the corner of the table, and no one mentioned it, because no one mentioned things directly in rooms like this. They arranged themselves around the absence and talked about everything else. At 10:49, her phone buzzed under the table. She ignored it. At 10:52, it buzzed again. At 10:54, Priya opened the boardroom door and caught Diane's eye with a look that said, "Now." Diane wrapped the presentation with her prepared closing. She'd rehearsed it enough that she could deliver it while her heart was doing something she didn't recognize. She called a 5-minute break and was in the hallway before the door finished closing. Prisha was 2 steps away, holding her phone like it was something fragile. "You need to read this." The email was from Hartwell Capital's office. It was 3 sentences. Hartwell Capital was withdrawing from all discussions regarding a potential investment in Callaway Infrastructure Partners, effective immediately. The decision was final. Further inquiries should be directed to legal counsel. Diane read it twice. She was aware of her own breathing, deliberate, controlled, the breathing of someone who has decided not to let anything show. "When did this come in?" 10:47, Priya said. 4 minutes ago. 47 minutes since the meeting had started. 47 minutes since the man in the flannel shirt had been walked out of the boardroom with his Tim Hortons cup. "Priya." Her voice was steady. "What does Evan Hartwell look like?" Priya looked at her, didn't speak for a moment. Then she pulled up a page on her phone, a conference bio, plain background, unremarkable headshot, and handed it over. Diane looked at the photograph. The photograph looked back. She handed the phone to Priya. She stood in the hallway outside a boardroom where 11 people were waiting for her, with the Ottawa River flat and silver beyond the glass, and she said nothing. Not for a long moment. "I need 5 minutes," she said finally. "You have 3, said Priya. She went to the washroom at the end of the hall. She ran cold water over her wrists, the way her grandmother had taught her when she was 14 and used to have panic attacks before swim meets. The cold brings you back, grounds you. Stops the mind from trying to leave the building. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She'd spent 4 weeks preparing. She'd rebuilt the pitch twice. She'd gotten the right roast of coffee. And she had walked a man out of her own boardroom without asking his name. The face in the mirror didn't have a lot to offer. She dried her hands. She walked back into the boardroom and told the room the meeting was concluded, that follow-up communications would come from her office, and that she thanked everyone for their time. She said it evenly. She didn't explain. After everyone had filed out, she sat at the empty table for 7 minutes. Franklin came back in without knocking. "What happened?" "We lost it." He made a sound of surprise that was very good, convincing almost. "How?" "The presentation was strong. What did they say?" "They withdrew," Diane said, "effective immediately." Franklin sat down across from her. He put his hands together on the table, the gesture of a man performing thoughtfulness, and said, "Did something go wrong technically? Was it the Q4 projections?" The presentation was fine. She looked at him. "I need to think." He nodded slowly. "Of course. We'll regroup. We'll find another path." He patted the table twice. She'd always found that gesture strange, the way certain men pat surfaces like they're settling animals, and stood. "This isn't over," he said, and left. Diane looked at the empty room. She looked at Evan Hartwell's chair, still pulled from the table at the angle a person leaves when they don't plan to come back. She didn't go home until after 9:30 that night. She rebuilt the timeline the way she used to replay bad races as a teenager, stroke by stroke, looking for the moment the wrong decision had compounded into the wrong result. The man had walked in at 9:57, flannel shirt. Tim Hortons, medium. He'd said, "I'm here for the 10 o'clock." Patricia Lau had said, "He comes separately." Devin had touched his arm, and she had turned away. She had turned away. She started digging the next morning. She pulled everything publicly available on Evan Hartwell, had her EA gather it, then went through it herself rather than assigning it to an analyst, because she didn't want this to become a story inside the company. Not yet. What she found was both more and less than she expected. He'd started Hartwell Capital at 29 with a handful of investors who'd believed in him for reasons that weren't entirely clear from any public record. In 5 years, he'd grown it into something that other fund managers talked about in hushed, slightly envious terms. He was 34. He had a son named Daniel. She found this in a single profile piece from a Sudbury regional outlet, apparently the only media he'd agreed to in 3 years, and only because a portion of the proceeds had gone to a trades apprenticeship program. The writer noted that he'd spent the interview deflecting personal questions by asking the writer about her own work, and that he had declined to describe himself as successful. "I've made good decisions," he'd said, "more often than not. That's the whole thing, really." She put the profile down and stood at her window, arms crossed. He had walked into her boardroom alone, with a Tim Hortons cup, and let himself be shown to the door. He had known what he was testing. The question was what the test had actually measured. She called Patricia Lau at 2 in the afternoon. It rang 4 times before voicemail. She left a message, composed, professional, no pressure in her voice, asking if Patricia might speak with her before the end of the week. Patricia called back 9 minutes later. "Miss Calloway," she said. That was all she said. "Thank you for calling back," Diane said. "I almost didn't." A pause. "What happened yesterday was embarrassing. Not for Mr. Hartwell, for your firm. I understand that. Do you?" Patricia's voice wasn't unkind. It was the voice of someone who said what they meant, because softening it would be a waste of both their time. "From where I sat, the CEO of a company asking for $80 million didn't recognize who she was meeting with and didn't bother to ask before having him removed." Diane breathed. "That's accurate. I failed to identify him. I let my staff manage the situation when I should have managed it myself." A pause. Longer. "He did it on purpose," Patricia said finally. "Walked in like that. He always does. First meeting, no announcement, no introduction from our side. He wants to see how a room treats someone who doesn't look like money. A beat. Most rooms fail. Did we fail worse than most?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Your coordinator was doing his job. The others followed his lead. That's your culture, not any one person." Another beat. "What he saw was you looking away. He wasn't watching Devin. He was watching you to see what you'd do, and you were already somewhere else." Diane stood very still. Outside, a pigeon landed on the window ledge, walked 3 steps, and flew off. "Is there anything I can do?" she said. "I don't know," Patricia said. "Probably not. He doesn't reopen things once they're closed, but he did ask me something this morning." A pause. "He asked if you made the call yourself or had your EA do it." Diane looked at her phone, her own name on the screen, dialing out. "I called myself," she said. "I know," Patricia said. "I told him that already." 3 days later, Stewart knocked and closed the door. He only closed the door when the news wasn't meant to travel through glass walls. "I've been going through the Northern Star numbers," he said. Northern Star Infrastructure Fund had approached them the morning after Hartwell withdrew. Diane had noted the timing. She told herself it was coincidence. She was starting to reconsider that. Stewart set a single sheet on her desk, covered in his small, careful handwriting. Northern Star's primary backer, through 2 shell entities, is a holding group called Ridgeway Advisory Partners. He paused. Ridgeway was incorporated 22 months ago. The registered agent is a law firm that, among other clients, represents our board chair, Franklin Reese. Diane looked at the paper. "How sure are you?" "I spent 11 hours on this," Stewart said. "I'm sure." She nodded. The room went very still. Franklin had pushed the Hartwell deal, had been, in his words, enthusiastic. And when it had collapsed, when she'd stood in that hallway reading a 3-sentence email, he'd come back into the boardroom and patted the table and said, "We'll find another path." He'd already built the path. She looked at Stewart. He looked back. They'd worked together for 4 years. He was 53 and had the face of someone who had arrived at a kind of exhausted resolve. "Don't tell anyone," she said. "Already haven't. Not yet. I need to think." She thought all night. At 7 the next morning, she was at the bakery on Elgin Street she'd been going to for 3 years, the one with the scuffed hexagonal tile floor and a woman named Bev behind the counter who had Diane's Americano started before she reached the register. She was at the window table with her second cup and a legal pad covered in her own handwriting when the door opened and a boy walked in. He was maybe 9. Dark jacket, laces on one shoe coming undone, a paperback book tucked under his arm like cargo. He looked around the bakery with the frank assessment of a child who had opinions about rooms. Then he walked to a corner table, settled in, opened the book, and began reading without looking up. Diane watched him for a moment, then went back to her notes. 2 minutes later, the door opened again. She knew before she looked. She didn't know how she knew. Maybe the way the room shifted again, that same quality of recalibration. Or maybe it was just pattern recognition, the thing her brain had been doing for 72 hours. Evan Hartwell walked in. Flannel shirt again, different color, green this time, faded at the elbows. He crossed to the corner table where the boy was sitting, set down a cup, said something low that made the boy look up briefly, and then immediately back at his book and opened his laptop. He didn't look at Diane. She looked at her legal pad for 90 seconds, which was approximately 85 seconds longer than it took her to decide. She got up. She walked to the table. She stood there until he looked up. 4 seconds, maybe. When he did, his expression was the same one she remembered, unhurried, attentive, not cold, not warm, just present. "I owe you an apology," she said. She hadn't planned the phrasing. Not a business apology, a real one. What happened in that room was wrong, and it was wrong because I wasn't paying attention to what actually mattered. Evan looked at her. The boy had not looked up, but his page turning had slowed. "You didn't have to make it easy for us to recognize you," Diane said. "You did, and we still got it wrong. I'm sorry." Something moved in his face, not surprise, not softness exactly, something more complicated than either. "Sit down," he said. She sat down. The boy looked up then, dark eyes, the same quality of attention, taking her in and then looking back at his book without comment. "This is Daniel," Evan said. He said the name the way people say the names of things they're careful with. "Hi, Daniel," Diane said. Daniel said nothing but held up his book cover briefly in her direction, a nature field guide, dog-eared, with pencil notes in the margins. "He annotates them," Evan said, not explaining it apologetically, just stating a fact about the world he lived in. Diane looked at Daniel's bent head. She thought about what to say and then said nothing, because sometimes silence was more honest than whatever word you could find. She looked at Evan. "I know what my company needs," she said. "I know what this deal would mean, and I'm not here to repitch it. But something is wrong inside my company, something bigger than a bad meeting, and I'm trying to understand its shape before I do something I can't undo." He watched her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you already left," she said. "You have no reason to be involved anymore. If you tell me what you know, it's because it's the right thing to do." A silence. The bakery moved around them, Bev calling out an order, the hiss of the espresso machine. Daniel turning a page. "Franklin Reese," Evan said. The name landed between them. "He made contact with our office 6 weeks before the meeting," Evans said. Through an intermediary, he communicated that the deal would be structured to include a consulting arrangement for an entity he was connected to. He represented this as standard practice within your firm. He paused. "When I arrived that morning, I wasn't only evaluating the pitch. I was evaluating whether what I'd been told was accurate, and then you were asked to wait in the lobby," Diane said. "Yes," he said, not with satisfaction, just factually. "Can I ask who the intermediary was?" He told her. A deal facilitator named Graham Cole connected out at least 2 other situations Evan knew of where a board insider had used him to position an outside investor for extraction. He said he could give her a written account of the approach, the date, what had been communicated, what had been implied. "On one condition," he said. "What's the condition?" "You're the one who walks into that room and lays it down. Not your lawyer. Not Stewart. You." She almost said, "Of course." She stopped because it wasn't of course, and he knew it, and she knew it. "I know," she said instead. "I know it has to be me." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. Daniel looked up from his field guide and pushed it across the table toward Diane. He'd opened it to a page about migratory birds. A penciled annotation in the margin read, "They come back even when it's still cold." "You can look," he said. Then he pulled it back and kept reading. Evan watched this without expression, though something in the set of his jaw had shifted slightly. "He annotates everything," he said again. Then quietly, "He annotated his school agenda last year. The teacher thought it was disruption. I thought it was attention." Diane looked at Daniel, this 9-year-old with his lace undone and his margin notes, and felt something shift in the morning. Not the crisis, which was still waiting for her. Something underneath it. A current running in a different direction. She picked up her legal pad. "I have a lot of work to do," she said. "I know," he said. She walked out into the March morning, which was cold and too bright and fully awake. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she started moving. She walked 11 blocks before she slowed. Motion helped her think. It always had, since she was a teenager pacing the pool deck before her events, while her teammates stretched inside. By the time she turned back toward her building, she had a list she hadn't written down, because some things you kept off paper for as long as you could. What she had: Stewart's documentation of the Northern Star Ridgeway Franklin connection. Evan's account of the intermediary approach, the timeline, Franklin pushing the Hartwell deal, the deal collapsing, Northern Star appearing the next morning like something that had been sitting in a waiting room. What she needed, the link that existed on paper, not just through shell entities, something that would survive a board vote, something a lawyer couldn't dismantle in 20 minutes. She was in her office by 9:15. Priya appeared in the doorway, read the room, and said, "Clear your afternoon?" "Yes," Diane said. "Tell everyone I'm in external meetings. And can you get me the full text of the shareholder agreement from 2019? The amended version." Priya was already typing. "Franklin called while you were out. Wants to schedule a strategic review." Diane stopped. When did he call? 8:56. 15 minutes after she'd left the bakery. 15 minutes after Evan Hartwell had presumably also left. Or enough time for word to travel if someone was paying attention to these things. She didn't know what Franklin had built or how deep it went. That was the problem. She was operating in a building she thought she knew, in the dark. "Tell him the review is postponed until next week," she said. "Give him Thursday. Don't tell him why." She paused. "If he pushes, tell him I'm managing the Hartwell fallout. That's true enough." She went into her office and closed the door and did something she hadn't done since her first year in the chair. She opened the bottom drawer and took out the binder her mother had put together when Diane had taken over. Her mother's handwriting on the tab, slightly unsteady by then from the MS, reading, "Everything you need if the house catches fire. Board structure, voting provisions, the specific language about removal of board members." She read for 2 hours. She took notes on paper she intended to shred later. She found a granola bar in the same drawer, ate it without tasting it, and kept reading. At 1 in the afternoon, Stuart knocked. He had the look he got when he'd been at a problem long enough that it had become personal. "Franklin has a registered interest in a financial advisory firm called Beaumont Group," he said. "It's disclosed. He filed it in a conflict of interest declaration 7 years ago when it wasn't relevant. But Beaumont Group is listed as a co-manager for the Northern Star Fund." He put a printed page on her desk. "They share a compliance officer. That's not proof," Diane said. "No," said Stuart. "But it's a thread." She looked at him. "How much of our internal financial communications does Franklin have access to?" Stuart was quiet for a moment. "As chair, technically, all of it. So he knew our runway numbers. Yes, he knew exactly how much we needed this deal. Yes." She leaned back. He had built the urgency and positioned himself to profit from the failure. She said it out loud, not to hear Stuart confirm it, but because hearing it outside her own head made it real in a different way. "I need everything you have on every decision he influenced in the last 3 years," she said. "Every advisory contract, every vendor he recommended, every deal that didn't close and what happened afterward. I need the pattern. That's going to take. I know how long it takes. That's why we're starting now." Stuart nodded. He stopped at the door. "Diane," he almost never used her first name. "When this is over, and I mean after, not during, you should think about how he got this far without anyone seeing it." He said it quietly, "Including us." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He left. She sat with that for a while. It was an uncomfortable thing to sit with, the idea that she'd been the one running the company, and she'd missed it. She'd been so focused on the outside, the market, the runway, the pitch, the deal. She hadn't been paying attention to the room she was already standing in. It was the same thing that had happened in the boardroom. She'd been watching the clock, watching the AV screen, and not watching the man standing by the window. She opened her laptop and began drafting. The first email went to the company's external legal counsel, a woman named Andrea Chow, who had been doing corporate litigation for 18 years and had the manner of someone who had seen every variety of institutional failure and had never once been surprised. Diane wrote 4 sentences and asked for a call. The second email went to her head of IT security, a quiet, methodical man named Patrick Seo, asking him to pull access logs for the internal financial system for the last 8 months. She didn't explain why. He would understand. The third email she wrote and deleted twice. It was addressed to Evan Hartwell. She thanked him. She told him what she'd found. Then she read it back and deleted it because it was wrong. He'd said clearly, "It has to be your business." She needed to carry this to the point where it was genuinely hers, not something she was borrowing his credibility to stand behind. Andrea Chow picked up on the second ring. "I was expecting your call," Andrea said. "When a CEO emails me 4 sentences and asks to speak that afternoon, something is happening inside the company." Talk. Diane talked for 14 minutes. When she finished, Andrea was quiet for a moment. "How solid is the financial documentation?" "My VP of Finance built it." "It's solid. The external account, the intermediary approach. Do you have anything written?" "First-hand account. Nothing on paper yet." "Written would be better." A pause. "Here's what I need. Don't confront the board member. Don't let him know you're looking. Get me everything by end of business Friday. And keep the circle small. Every person you tell is a variable." She paused. "If what you're describing is accurate, you're looking at breach of fiduciary duty at minimum, possibly securities fraud, depending on the Northern Star structure." Diane breathed. "Okay, you're doing the right thing by coming now. The wrong thing would have been waiting until you were sure. No one's ever sure enough at the start." Something loosened slightly in Diane's chest. Not relief, too early for that. More like the recognition that she was no longer walking through this particular dark alone. Patrick Seo's access logs arrived at 4:20 the next afternoon. He included a single line at the bottom. "I flagged some anomalies you'll want to look at, easier to walk through in person." She wrote back, "Tomorrow, 7:30, my office. Tell no one." He wrote back one word, "Understood." The anomalies were in the access records for the internal projections database, the one that held multi-year financial modeling and sensitivity analyses. Someone had been pulling documents from it at intervals over 8 months. Carefully. The way you did it if you knew someone like Patrick was watching. The credentials belonged to an account registered to a third-party consultant retained by the board 20 months ago. A consultant whose engagement, Diane now noted, had been championed and approved by the chair. She looked at the clock, 11:50. She'd been in the building for 15 hours. She drove home. She made toast and ate it standing at her kitchen counter, which she recognized as something she needed to stop doing. She went to bed in her clothes. She lay on top of the covers and looked at the ceiling and tried to feel tired enough to sleep. She wasn't. Richard. Franklin. She kept catching herself thinking of him as Richard, which was her uncle's name, someone she'd trusted without question for her entire childhood. She wasn't sure what that meant. Franklin Reese had been building this for at least 20 months, probably longer. He'd used his access, his position, the trust a board places in its chair, trust she had also placed in him, to construct something that served himself at the expense of a company her parents had built from a small firm in Sudbury. He'd used her. He'd used her mother's illness and the vulnerability of the transition and her own relative inexperience in those first years. He'd waited and watched and moved slowly, and the thing she kept coming back to, lying there in her work clothes at midnight, was how patient it must have required. She fell asleep with the light on. Friday morning, Andrea Chow arrived at 9 with a briefcase and the look of someone who'd already reviewed everything Diane had sent the night before. "Here's where we are," she said before sitting down. She laid it out with surgical precision. What they had was substantial, not yet airtight, but significant enough to bring to the board. What they still needed was either a paper record of the intermediary approach or additional documentation linking Franklin to the financial extractions across the full timeline. "The access logs help," Andrea said. "If we can establish that Franklin directed the consultant's activities, we can argue his access by proxy." She tapped the report. "And this acquisition from 2 years ago, the one killed on his recommendation, picked up by a connected firm 8 months later, that's a pattern. That's not coincidence." Diane nodded. "The intermediary account," Andrea said, looking up. "Can you get a written statement?" Diane thought about the bakery, about Evan's voice, even and unhurried, and the line he'd drawn and where it sat. "I don't know," she said honestly. He was clear about not being involved. "I'm not asking you to push him. But if he's willing, even a written account, not a legal declaration, it changes the weight of what we're bringing." A pause. The board can act without it, but a corroborating source outside the company shifts the conversation. After Andrea left, Diane sat at her desk for 10 minutes. She thought about what Evan had said. It has to be your business first. He hadn't said he wouldn't help. He'd wanted her to carry it to the point where it was genuinely hers. She thought she'd reached that point. She sent him a text message. Short. She said she wasn't asking for help with the deal. She said she would explain when they spoke. She put the phone down and told herself not to watch it. She watched it for 3 minutes before it buzzed. His reply, "Tomorrow. Same place." 7:30, she exhaled. The next morning he was already there when she arrived. Daniel was presumably at school. Evan had the same Timmy's coffee and was reading something on his phone, and when she sat down he looked up with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was complete without being performative. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to know I've already built the case without your answer. I'm not asking you to rescue anything." He nodded once. "Graham Cole," she said, "is there anything you can give me in writing? Not testimony, not a legal filing, what you observed, documented." Evan wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at the window for a moment, the Elgin Street morning, people moving with weekend purpose. "Who's your lawyer?" he said. "Andrea Chow." Something moved in his expression. "I know Andrea. She's good." He was quiet. "I can give you a written account of the approach, The date, what was communicated, and what was implied. The specific terms he described, terms that never appeared in anything you authorized. That's what I need. I'll have it to Andrea by end of day. He paused. Same condition. I know, she said. I walk in myself. He nodded. Daniel's field guide was on the table. He must have left it the day before. The cover annotation in careful pencil. D. Hartwell, age 9, Sudbury Region Observations. She looked at it for a moment, then at Evan. He's from Sudbury originally, she said. We both are, Evan said. I moved for the firm. He's still deciding if he forgives me for it. Something in the way he said it, the particular rueful plainness of it, made her almost laugh. I'm from Sudbury, she said. He looked at her. I know, he said. It was in your company profile. Calloway Infrastructure started there. A beat. It's part of why I looked twice. They sat for a while after that, the conversation moving through other things. A development in the municipal infrastructure sector he'd been watching. A project Calloway had completed the previous summer that had apparently come up in conversation with another investor. Easy. The way conversations were easy between people who were used to moving through complicated things without needing to announce each step. She left at 8:20. He walked to the door with her. On the sidewalk, cold breath visible in the March air, he said, Don't let him reframe it in that room. He's going to try. I know he is. He'll make it about your judgment, about the Hartwell meeting. He'll make the mistake yours. I know, she said. I'm not going to let him. Evan looked at her for a moment. No, he said, like he was confirming something he'd already decided. I don't think you are. She walked to her car. She didn't look back. The emergency board meeting was set for Monday at 10. Diane had submitted the formal request Sunday evening through legal channels, citing the emergency disclosure provision, listing Andrea and Stuart as witnesses. 6 of the 7 board members confirmed by 9 Sunday night. Franklin's confirmation came in at 10:40, late, which told her something about the hour he'd spent deciding whether to appear. She rode the elevator to the boardroom floor alone on Monday morning. She thought about nothing specific. She was past the thinking stage. This was the doing stage, and that required something different, the part of her that went quiet and moved forward. The boardroom looked exactly the same. Windows on 2 sides, the river, the city. The same room where a man in a flannel shirt had stood near the window with a Tim Hortons cup and been asked to wait downstairs. She set her documents at the head of the table, her chair, not Franklin's, before anyone arrived. Andrea to her left, Stuart across. The room filled over the next 10 minutes. 4 other board members, 2 independent directors, the company's general counsel. Franklin arrived at 10:01. Charcoal blazer, open collar. He came in with his usual warmth already moving ahead of him through the space, the practiced ease, the brief eye contact with each person. He looked at Diane at the head of the table. Something crossed his face, quick, a recalibration. Then the warmth came back. Unusual format for a Monday, he said pleasantly. It is, she said. Thank you for making the time. He settled in. He looked at Andrea, at Stuart, at the bound document in front of Diane's hands. His eyes moved across the room with the attention of someone who had read enough rooms to know when one had been arranged against him. He decided to look relaxed. She began. She did it the way Andrea had outlined, timeline first, pattern before name. She walked through the access logs with the precision of someone who had memorized every date and credential and accessed file. She watched the faces of the board members. The audit rep's expression tightening, one of the independent directors leaning forward, the general counsel going still in the specific way. Lawyers went still when they understood exactly what they were looking at. She presented the advisory contracts. She walked through the acquisition from 2 years ago. Killed on Franklin's recommendation, picked up 8 months later by a connected firm. She presented the Northern Star connection, the shell entities, the Ridgeway Advisory Link, Beaumont Group, the compliance officer, who appeared on both sides of a wall that wasn't supposed to have doors. She heard Franklin shift in his chair. I'd like to pause here, he said. His voice was smooth, calibrated. I think there's significant context being omitted, and I'd like to... Under the emergency disclosure provision, Diane said without raising her voice, a sitting CEO may not be interrupted during an active integrity disclosure until the disclosure is complete. She looked at him directly. I'd ask you to hold your response until I'm finished. Thank you, Franklin. The room went quiet. She held his gaze for the 3 seconds it required to make clear she had no intention of looking away. Then she looked back at her documents and continued. She presented the written account from Evan last. She introduced it as a statement from an external principal, obtained voluntarily, identifying the intermediary approach made to Hartwell Capital in the weeks prior to the partnership meeting. She didn't use Evan's name. The document was attributed to an external investment principal, sufficient for the board's purposes. She read 3 passages from the statement. The first identifying Graham Cole by name and describing the approach. The second detailing what had been communicated about the advisory arrangement and who had been represented as authorizing it. The third documenting the date and specific terms that had never appeared in any version of the deal structure Diane had prepared or approved. She set the document down. She looked up at the room. The audit rep was looking at Franklin. Both independent directors were looking at Franklin. The general counsel had stopped writing and was looking at the table. Franklin looked at Diane. This was the moment Andrea had described. She saw it in real time. The slight lean forward, the expression recalibrating towards something that wanted to read as wounded reason. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across boardroom tables and restaurant tables for 6 years. The way she had always read as collegial. The way she now understood as something else entirely. She looked back. She did not look away. These are serious allegations, Franklin said. His voice had lost something at the edges. And I want to be clear that I take them seriously. But what we have here is a set of circumstantial connections and an unnamed external account presented by a CEO who is under significant pressure following a failed capital raise. I think what this board owes the company is perspective. David, Diane said, to the general counsel, would you read the fiduciary duty provision from Section 9? He read it. 11 words. Not much wiggle room. Documented evidence of a pattern of conduct over 22 months, with financial benefit to connected parties, Diane said satisfies the burden for emergency review under that provision. She looked at the full table. I'm not asking this board to convict anyone. I'm asking you to authorize an independent audit of every transaction, advisory contract, and deal recommendation involving the chair over the past 3 years. And I'm moving, under the emergency provision, that Franklin Reese recuse himself from all board activities pending the outcome of that audit. Silence. The kind that had weight. The oldest independent director, a man named Gordon Strang, 67, who had been on the board since before Diane had taken the chair and who spoke rarely but with precision when he did, looked at Franklin with an expression that was not warm. I think we've heard the disclosure, Gordon said. I think we should vote. Franklin looked at Gordon. Something collapsed in his face. Not dramatically, not a movie moment. More like watching a retaining wall develop a hairline fracture, the structure still trying to hold while something fundamental had shifted in what was underneath it. I'd like to speak to counsel before any vote, Franklin said. You're welcome to do that after, Gordon said. Is the motion properly constituted, Andrea? Andrea nodded. It is. Then let's proceed. The vote took 5 minutes. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed 5-1. The motion for Franklin's recusal pending the audit passed 5-1. The single opposing vote on both motions was Franklin's own. He cast it looking straight ahead, not at Diane. His jaw was set. The warmth was entirely gone from his face, replaced by the expression of a man who had spent years building something and was watching it be dismantled by the person he had most underestimated. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Diane and she looked at him. You're making a mistake, he said quietly, the voice under the voice, harder and smaller and less impressive than what he used for the room. I don't think I am, she said. He left. The door closed. She stood at the head of the table and felt the room reconfigure around his absence. Board members who had been sitting rigid were leaning back. The audit rep was already on her phone. Stewart was writing quickly. Andrea was gathering documents with focused efficiency. She had more work ahead and no time to spend on release of tension. Gordon Strang caught Diane's eye from across the table. He didn't say anything. He gave her one slow nod, the kind that carried more weight than a sentence would have. I saw what that cost. It was the right thing. She nodded back. She stood at the head of the table until the room had mostly cleared. Then she sat down because her legs were doing something she didn't want to display while people were still walking past. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed. The river outside was the same river it had been at 10. It would be the same river tonight. The continuity of it was, she found, actually useful. Andrea sat back down across from her. You held the room. I held the room, Diane said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. After Andrea left, Stewart stayed. He was sitting across from her with the particular look of someone who had arrived, after a long haul, at a kind of exhausted relief. By Wednesday, it'll be public, he said. Probably Tuesday. You need to get ahead of communications. Employees first, she said. Before press, before investors. The people in this building hear from me before they read about it somewhere else. Stewart nodded. Your mother called, he said, almost as an afterthought. While you were in there. Priya took the message. Diane looked at him. Priya told her you were in a meeting, he said. She just wanted you to know she was thinking about you. She held that for a moment. Her mother, who had built this company from a small firm in Sudbury and handed it to Diane with one hand, and held her own diagnosis with the other, who had sent a mocha pot because she knew Diane wouldn't take care of herself otherwise. Diane looked at the empty boardroom. She looked at the chair where Franklin had been sitting, pushed back at the angle of someone who had left in a hurry. She thought about a bakery on Elgin Street, a boy with a dog-eared field guide and a pencil annotation. They come back even when it's still cold. She reached into her bag and found her phone. She typed a message to Evan. She kept it short. Board voted. Audit authorized. He's recused. She looked at it for a moment and added, I held the room. She sent it. She put the phone on the table and looked at the river. It buzzed. 3 words. I know you did. She looked at the message. She didn't know how he knew, whether word had already moved, or whether it was simply what he'd expected after the bakery, after the conversation, after watching her carry something he'd handed her and then step aside. She thought it was the latter, the particular confidence of someone who had assessed a person carefully and was not surprised by the result. She looked at the boardroom one more time. The light on the table, the empty chairs, the river beyond the glass, already indifferent, already moving on. She had a company to run. She picked up her bag and walked out. Priya was at her desk when she stepped off the elevator. She looked up. Read Diane's face. I already have Stuart on hold and your communications team can do a 1 o'clock. Push it to noon, Diane said. And call my mother back, please. Tell her I'll call her tonight. Priya made the note. You okay? Diane thought about it honestly. Getting there, she said. She went into her office and closed the door. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at the city. Somewhere out there was a bakery with scuffed hexagonal tile and a woman named Bev who started the Americano before you reached the counter, and a window table where 2 people had sat across from each other on a March morning and talked about the kind of help that doesn't take anything from you in the giving. Somewhere out there was a 9-year-old who annotated field guides in the margins and had left one on a bakery table without apparently thinking twice about it, which was either carelessness or trust. And she found she didn't think it was carelessness. She turned from the window and sat down. She reached for her phone to call her mother. While she waited for the line to connect, she looked at the mug on her desk, barely functioning, surviving every late night and hard morning because it was too familiar to notice until you needed something to look at, and felt, for the first time in a month, something that wasn't a strategy or a prepared response. Her mother picked up on the second ring. Di, she said. Just that. Her mother's name for her, from when she was small. Hi, Mom, Diane said, and then surprising herself, it's done, the hard part's done. Her mother was quiet for a moment, then I know you. 3 words. Diane held the phone, the river outside, the March light on the desk. I know, she said finally, I know you do.